The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. Today is this, I'm trying to figure out how to get this light so that it's not in my eyes. Today is the 7th and final day of this 7-day sesshin here at Mountain Gate in northern New Mexico. And it has been a deep sesshin so far. Deep sesshins don't mean glorious feelings. They don't necessarily mean some level of bliss. What they mean is deep work has been going on. People have been encountering their stuff, which gives such an opportunity to work on releasing it. And it's been such a sesshin. I'd like to share with you first some of the writing of Harada Tangen Roshi. He was an amazing human being. It's interesting that typically the way bodhisattvas are portrayed in art is they have long floppy earlobes, and he had long floppy earlobes. He was the most humble, open, giving human being I've ever met, really. I did Rohatsu Sesshin with him in 1992 and also visited Bukoguchi a couple of other times. And there's a long connection between Tangen Roshi and Roshi Keplo, because Tangen was a monk at Hoshinji when Keplo Roshi ended up there, and he actually became kind of Keplo Roshi's guardian angel. He spoke a few words of English. He wasn't seriously fluent, but his pronunciation was very understandable. Some Japanese English is not at all, you don't necessarily recognize it's English. But in his case, you could understand what he was saying, even though there was an accent. For example, during that Rohatsu Sesshin, he came to the Zendo and he said, relax knees, relax knees. And that's pretty straightforward. It was an interesting teaching, really, because until that time, it never occurred to me that one might even consider trying to be relaxed on the cushion. It had been a place of great tension for me for a long time. But relax your knees. Zen is not meant to be a torture. It is only painful and difficult as we encounter our stuff, that core issue that Joko Beck spoke of, and the ways we dealt with that core issue and how we compensated for it. But let me continue with something of Tangen Roshi. From childhood on, as though in search of something, I was always rather rebellious. In junior high school, I kept thinking I'd never been given the opportunity to understand the reason for living. I didn't much care for Buddhist priests. I had the preconceived idea that they wore funny clothes, talked a lot of nonsense, and led lives of comfort and ease. And then he happened upon a book that was apparently translated, and I'm not quite sure translated from what, maybe the Chinese, by Daiyun Sogaku Harada Roshi, who eventually adopted him, by the way. That's why his last name is Harada Tangen, and who became his teacher and his who sanctioned him to teach himself. And it was at Harada Tangen Roshi's Hoshinji temple that he and Roshi Kapleau encountered each other and became fast friends. So whatever the book was, he said, this book really addressed itself to that something I'd been searching for since childhood. And it surprised me to realize that the lesson came through a priest. Although Inshitsuroku is at heart Confucian, not Buddhist, it is a Zen master who clearly points the way. And incidentally, the man who translated the book, Harada Tangen Roshi, was to become 5 years later my Zen teacher. When I was 18 or 19 years old, I resolved to become like a chair. This is not your usual optimal, well, what most people would aim at becoming like. But here's some more about it. That was because a chair doesn't refuse its services to anybody. It just takes care of the sitter and lets him rest his legs. After it's served its purpose, no one gets up and thanks it or offers words of kindness to the chair. It will more likely get kicked out of the way. What's more, the chair doesn't grumble or complain or bear a grudge, but just takes whatever is given. When there's a job to be done, it puts forth all its energy without picking and choosing according to its desires. I was thinking, wouldn't it be great to have such a heart? I wrote on a big sheet of paper, be like a chair, and every day took note of how close I came. If even a little dissatisfaction arose, I would regard that as an embarrassing state of mind for a chair. I consider how thoroughly I was of use to others. A chair doesn't plop itself down on top of the sitter, right? What was positive about all this was that if I possibly could, I wanted to put others before myself. The endeavor was not at all forced or unnatural, and this is important. He honestly, earnestly yearned to be of service. Honestly, earnestly yearned to do what he could to help people. It arose from life itself and was enjoyable, not painful. During the time I was following this practice, I went to climb Mount Kimboku, a rather small mountain of the Jukoku Pass at Yugawara. As I climbed that day, I could think of nothing but my own selfishness. Shedding tears, I repeatedly reflected and repented as I made the 30-minute ascent up the mountain trail. There was a large stone statue on the flat crest of the mountain. If I saw it today, I might know what it was. But at that time, I had no idea. Along the way, there had been a number of figures of Kannon, so I think perhaps the statue was of Shakyamuni Buddha. But in those days, I knew nothing of Buddhism or of paying homage to its founder. I had, however, committed to memory the rules of Professor Shoin Yoshida's preparatory school, and I began to chant those rules. Through chanting, I must have entered into a purer state of mind. Because he climbed up that mountain, filled with a yearning to offer himself as freely as possible to the service of humankind. His mind, in a sense, had been clarified, so that when he chanted those rules, and we have no idea what those rules were, somehow he entered into a samadhi. I crossed to the other side of the mountain, which formed a precipice. A valley had been gouged out below, and beyond the valley stretched the Pacific Ocean. To one side, I could see the rolling hills of the Izu Peninsula. Transfixed by the mountain landscape, the wind blew into me from the valley floor. And I felt as if I were growing bigger and bigger. In retrospect, we could say that I was experiencing the reality of being one with and cared for by all things of this world, experiencing the greatness of life I had been given. And this is available to each one of us. It's only our ideas about ourselves, our pain and our suffering, and how we work with that and get caught in it, that prevents us from realizing this experience. We could say that I was experiencing the reality of being one with and cared for by all things of this world, experiencing the greatness of the life I had been given. But at the time, I just felt myself becoming bigger and the sensation of being protected by everyone. At that point, I couldn't contain myself anymore. So in a giant voice, I shouted my name 7 or 8 times into the far off horizon. But I still couldn't keep still. And suddenly I dashed off down the mountain path. Flying down a mountain trail is risky, but I made it back to Atami Station without tumbling into the valley below. It was as if I shot down in one breath. As nobody knew my state of mind at the time, if I had tripped and fallen down into the valley, everyone probably would have thought I had committed suicide. Although I had felt at the time that I would often return to pay my respects to that dear beloved mountain, I've not been back even once. Since that time, a bright and changed world unfolds before me. A bright and changed world unfolds before me. For 1 or 2 months after the experience, everything, down to the pebbles along the roadside, brilliantly glistened. It is an intimate, friendly life. I remember well being filled with the knowledge of being together, part of the same life. At the time, I still knew nothing of Zazen and such, but the walls separating me from others had collapsed. My life had become a world somehow without discrimination. So I felt as if I could even chat with the chirping sparrows. Later, when I began to do Zazen, I could receive the teachings of my master, which I had sought since childhood, with a completely open and receptive mind. Without theoretical understanding and without being able to explain what happened, I had tapped into the very joy of life. And I had determined from then on to dedicate my life to repaying my gratitude. And so eventually he became a Buddhist monk, and then eventually became a Buddhist teacher. And he died a few years ago, but it was an immense privilege to have come into his presence more than once and to do sesshin with him. And what he realized is something that every single one of us can. This is why we do Zazen, is to open to that innate perfection that we are, to the beauty and the joy that is life when we live it fully without prejudice. That's kind of hard to do. Let's share a little bit more from Joko Beck about this very subject. This is from a chapter entitled Cutting Off Escape. And that is interesting because I think it was the first book that Pema Chodron wrote was called The Wisdom of No Escape. Here we sit on the cushion. And of course, we can escape if we want to. We can daydream, we can make fantasies about all kinds of stuff. And often in the early years of practice, we do that. But at a certain point, we either, as the saying goes, put up or shut up. We either leave practice or we start really working on it. It takes some time to get to a point where we can do that. So here's Joko. So much of our practice is noticing what we do. You won't notice it all because some of it we don't yet have any idea about, but we'll notice something. We notice the string of thoughts that continually arise when we sit. Not all our thoughts spring from our core belief or its anxious attendant, our basic strategy. Sometimes we're just noticing a car going by and thinking about that. But usually, even if we are just thinking about what to have for dinner, our thoughts are flowing out of the core belief. And that is probably the major challenge to Zen practice, is trying to work with that core belief and, as she put it, its attendant basic strategy. And she talks about how, noticing our thoughts, we begin to get a sense of the play of them. She continues, something begins to dawn on us, and we start to know ourselves as we've never known before. But there's no guarantee this will happen. Unfortunately, we usually want to escape from ourselves and get on with seeing if our basic strategy can figure our life out. The discipline of sitting still, done diligently, cuts off that escape. When you cut it off, you're left with a direct experience of life. Well, or at least a direct experience of your avoidance of life. And it's that direct experience of avoidance of life that has to be worked through first in order to have a direct experience of a truer life. When you cut it off, you're left with a direct experience of life. It's a very different thing from not having that direct experience. A life that has a little bit of that every day is very different than a life that has none. What we need to do, but what we really don't want to do, is return to the pain of our core belief. And we try to avoid this core belief because it's so painful. And so we compensate in many ways. We usually project what we feel about ourselves on other people, not realizing that that's what we're doing. Suppose you feel you've never been able to succeed. You're a failure. What does it feel like? We don't want to rest in that feeling. The core belief says, you're wasting your time. You need to be out fixing the world, taking care of me. It is always offering this escape from our feelings. To begin to rest in sensation is at the heart of practice. It's good to know what our core belief is, to know it's a mistaken belief, and to be able to see what strategies we use in service of that belief. I would say that pretty much everybody who comes to Zen practice comes out of a core belief of being worthless. And yet we're not worthless, but we don't recognize that. And trying to avoid the feeling that we're worthless and just simply makes us act out of a rejection of that and a projection of it onto other people. But all that knowing doesn't solve a thing. What solves it is when we return and rest right here where we don't want to rest. We try to do this, but instead we wallow in it or obsess about it. Wallowing and obsessing can be very dramatic and actually very rewarding feeling. And of course, the drama is always interesting, but we should be suspicious of it. Wallowing or obsessing is still thinking about our experience and not residing in it. And then this next section is called Sitting Isn't a Virtue. We can develop the muscle of being able to reside in the pain of the core belief. Sitting builds muscle that allows us to stay and rest for a moment in our own experience. That's why it's important. Not because sitting is some virtue in itself. Sitting isn't a virtue. It's just a chance to play with this problem of the self. You have to be careful that sitting itself doesn't become the strategy. Sitting can be the biggest escape of all. It can become a real hang-up if you're attached to your identity as a sitter or a meditator. I mentioned the guy who was striding back and forth with one eye, theoretically reading a copy of the 3 Pillars of Zen, hoping that Roshi Kapleau would come out of his quarters and see him and admire him for reading that book. Of course, it didn't work, but we all have some level of that. Well, I wouldn't say we all have some level of that. Some people have some level of trying to make an appearance of being an important Zen sitter. I'm always suspicious when people rush out and suddenly buy all the paraphernalia that makes it look like they're sitting in Zen. Because often those people don't stick it out. If you have an idea of yourself as someone who has a Zen practice or someone who sits, you have to be very careful not to respond reflexively to everything that happens with, it doesn't bother me. The fact is, it probably does bother you. The first step is to be honest with yourself. You are whatever you are, whether it's irritated, angry, scared, or defensive. That's what needs to be worked with. Otherwise, you miss your chance to feel in yourself what really is. Zen students are particularly liable to have these kinds of ideals. It doesn't bother me. Everything's fine. I'm above that kind of issue. But we're not. I once had a student who kept challenging me about little things. I was fine with that. I told my daughter, I see what the student is doing. It's obvious why he's doing that. And it doesn't bother me. And she said, Mom, how do you really feel? And I said, oh, I'm mad. And the next section is the way we want things. Our nature as human beings is to want everything just the way we want it. But it's never the way I want it. Know what I mean? There's always something going wrong in relation to my plans for the day or with my interactions with other people. It's a classic human seeming solution. It's universal that pretty much everybody tries to make the other guy fit their ideal of who they need to have interacting with them. And of course, it doesn't really work because everybody's trying to do that to everybody else instead of looking within themselves. Kapleau Roshi used to say, if you want to attract somebody, be the somebody you want to attract. If you want somebody who's kind and caring and loving, be kind and caring and loving. And interestingly enough, it does. There's a responsive communion. There's also responsive communion when we're not that way. We can be hurting deeply inside and lash out suddenly out of that pain, out of anger, out of frustration. And all that does is send people away. But if we can open to our tender heart, open to the pain that we all have and feel it. And one of the good things that happens out of that is we have greater empathy for other people in pain. And gradually, we become able to be present with our pain. And so it doesn't drive us to behave in ways that we never would want to behave. None of us want to be acting in ways that we find ourselves acting. It's like Tangen Roshi said, walking up that mountain, he was aghast because he felt he was not behaving in the way he wanted to behave. And he kept repenting that behavior, feeling it deeply. Otherwise, he would not have been able to have the experience that he had. When someone does something that we don't like, it's fine to not like it. But we have a chance to practice with our emotional reaction, our anger or sense of outrage or hurt. There's a difference between stopping someone's inappropriate action, which can be a good and necessary thing to do, and acting out of our core belief. If you feel you're fundamentally imperfect and that feels unbearable, an excellent way to cover it up is to try and control or fix somebody else. You feel other people should be different, more perfect than they are. Your life is right here. As we sit with this thing we don't want to sit with, we have a chance to cut off the escape, learn to reside in our experience and let it be. If we can stop trying to fix it or change it or be mad at it, it begins to transform us. We don't have to transform it. It transforms us. We become more spacious. It's as though you have more room around you. Now, this is where you enter a growth that is hard to describe. You will sense in yourself as you're practicing that your life grows increasingly free of judgment. It's increasingly free of your self-centered hassle, including your own self-judgment, which is usually at the core of all pain. We can't catch it all. We're all busy people doing lots of things, but try to work with one thing a day when you're sitting. It doesn't need to be your whole sitting period, and it doesn't have to be while you're sitting at all. Just try to honestly experience one thing a day that's upsetting you. You don't have to tell anyone. You can feel whatever you feel, no matter how ugly, petty, or scary. We have to work with the truth, or we miss an opportunity. In order to uncover the amazing beingness that we are, the wonderful human being that every single one of us is and always was, despite what we may think of ourselves, despite how we were treated. And it only is through walking into this pain, in my personal experience, that we can become free of it and open to that blossoming of the beauty of who we really are. The compassion, the wisdom coming forth. It's a long haul. I've been working at this for more than 40 years. I still expect to be working at it for lifetimes. But how amazing to be even able to work on it one day. So as we go into the last few hours of this sesshin, there's less than half a day. There's only a few hours left. But those hours are potent with promise. And inch by inch, we can become a little bit more free of our stuff. And then we keep on going. And one day we realize we feel very differently than we did a few years back. It works if we are willing to feel the pain. I leave that with you. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now, recite the 4 vows.